seconded by Mr. Lobb, moves that the House call on the Liberal government to immediately repeal the carbon tax on farmers, First Nations, and families.
The honourable member for Carleton.
Canadians are hungry for Parliament to pass today's common sense Conservative motion that the House call on the government to immediately repeal the carbon tax on farmers, First Nations, and families. When I say they are hungry for us to pass this motion, I mean it literally. Here are the facts. 2 million Canadians used a food bank in a single month in Canada. Since 2016, there's been an 82% increase in the number of workers in Ontario using food banks. A single mother of 2 in Sydney, Nova Scotia said, quote, "Well, this month I had to choose between eating and heating. My kids are getting fed, but my house is freezing." For the first time in 60 years, Madam Speaker, rents in Canada are outpacing income, according to the Bank of Montreal. Halifax, ironically, in the province of the Prime Minister's own housing minister, now has 35 homeless encampments. According to Dalhousie University's Agri-Food and Analytics, buying holiday foods this year will be, quote, an expensive proposition. And a growing number of Canadians are forced to work 2 jobs. Rafiq Khan is a full-time student. He works full-time for a not-for-profit and has a second job at a car rental company. He said, quote, "You just can't hear your body scream for more rest." His body screams for rest, Madam Speaker. I see, as I travel this country, the young, emaciated, working-class people who clearly have lost weight, who have black bags under their eyes from fatigue. I bump into them in airport lobbies at 11 p.m. as they tell me that they are entering their 16th or 17th hour of work on that day, not because they're squirreling away for a down payment on a home. They've long given up on that. But because they must work nonstop just to feed themselves and to pay the rent, to avoid becoming homeless. In the meantime, they are hopeless because they see no light at the end of the tunnel. Madam Speaker, Trevor Ross, CEO of the Central Okanagan Food Bank, talking about food bank usage in his community, said, and I quote, "What we are projecting is another 100% increase in the next 3 or 4 months because of inflation." Cynthia Bolter, Chief Operating Officer of the Greater Vancouver Food Bank, said, "We are seeing parents who are skipping meals so their children can eat. We see people who haven't eaten in days. We see seniors who haven't had produce in months." Christine McCallum, a resident of Marshfield, PEI, said, Marshfield, PEI said, and I quote, "We don't buy orange juice as often as we used to because that is a luxury. Orange juice is a luxury in Canada after 8 years of this Prime Minister." Patrick Gallagher, a part-time worker living in a homeless shelter, said, and I quote, "I've lived in my car 6-7 months, and then I came here." He said, adding he's not sure how he will ever afford his own place. "The rents are really high, and it's hard to find places," he said. This is someone who works full time. Madam Speaker, I have met carpenters who live in parking lots. And when we have an economy where the people who build our homes cannot afford to live in them, it is a fundamentally unjust system, and something must change. Indeed, Canadians are hungering, literally hungering for that change. Now, this is life. This is life after 8 years of Justin Trudeau and the Liberal government. I withdraw the Prime Minister's name. After 8 years of this Prime Minister, this is the misery that Canadians are living. This is 8 years after he promised he would help the middle class and those working hard to join him. Remember those people? You don't hear about them anymore. No, now that he's got their votes, he doesn't need to worry about them. The reason he would never mention the middle class and those working hard to join is because obviously the whole nation would break down into simultaneous laughter and tears, both hilarity and tragedy, at the irony that this man would talk about the middle class after he robbed them of the birthright in Canada, that you could own a home if you worked hard, that you could nourish your family with good food. These were things we took for granted 8 years ago. Now, these are things onto which Canadians are forced to desperately cling. And what is the Prime Minister's promise now? To quadruple the carbon tax on the farmers that feed our people. Now, let's talk about the impact this is having. Just today, we have a new report from Canada's food professor. Professor Charlebois of Dalhousie University produced a report indicating that next year Canadians will spend $701 more to feed their families. Now, this is on top of the 20% food price inflation we've had just in the last couple of years. Next year, the average family of four will need to spend $16,297 to feed their children and themselves. Projections from this report indicate that for the coming year, food inflation will be between 2.5 and 4.5%, on top of the pre-existing food price increases. Now, Liberals will say, oh, well, inflation is coming down. Prices are going up. The 20% increase in the cost of food is not going away. The 2 to 4% increase that will come this year will be compounded on top of the previous increases. The Prime Minister said, well, he might be quadrupling the carbon tax on farmers and truckers who bring us our food, but don't worry, he's having meetings with CEOs of grocery chains. Well, clearly it hasn't worked, because food prices continue to go up again after the dozens of promises that he would make food more affordable. I'm going to read from this report again. In 2024, it is probable that Canadians will continue to experience the strain of food inflation, compounded by increasing costs of housing, energy, and various other expenditures. Canadians are facing stricter budgets as they contend with higher costs of living, as rents continue to increase, interest rates have risen, and household debt is up. Food and beverage retail data show that between 2022 and 2023, Canadians reduced the amount they spent on food and beverage retail by 3.26%. They're eating less. They're paying more to eat less. So they're having to cut back on their nutritional budgets. They're buying less nutritional food. They're buying smaller portions where the nutrition is literally stripped out of it and replaced with manufactured oils and artificial sweeteners and flavors so that they can trick their palate into thinking that they're nourishing their bodies. A recent report by TransUnion, I'm now quoting from the report from the Agri-Food Analytics group at Dalhousie. A recent report by TransUnion found that the average Canadian has a credit card debt of $4,000 and a 4.2% increase in household debt compared to last year. The problem is getting worse, Madam Speaker. That increase in household debt is on top of the fact that Canada already has the highest household debt in the G7 by a country mile. No one else is even close. We now have approximately $1.80 in debt for every dollar in household income. And all of that debt is rolling over into higher interest rates, which this Prime Minister's deficits have caused. I quote the report further. Food prices are not the only increase in expenses that Canadians are facing, as other commodities are still feeling the effects of inflation. And household expenses like rent and utilities are also increasing year over year. The last 2 months have been the fastest months of increase in the rent. And the Prime Minister's plan, after having caused all this misery throughout 8 years, and I will be sharing my time with the member for Haliburton, Kawartha Lakes, Brock, who comes from a farming community. The Prime Minister proposes to quadruple the carbon tax on the farmers who make the food and the truckers who ship the food. Conservatives are going to fight tooth and nail to stop this Prime Minister from getting on his surfboard and leaving this place until he agrees to pass our common sense proposal to axe the tax on farmers, First Nations, and families heating their homes. Can the Prime Minister put his ego and his ideological obsessions aside so that Canadians can feed themselves this Christmas? It's common sense of the common people united for our common home.
Questions